The air in Colorado territory tasted of rust and endings. It was a fine, red dust that coated the tongue, settled in the creases of the eyes, and promised nothing but more of the same tomorrow. For 3 days. Mira had walked with that taste in her mouth, a constant reminder of the life she was leaving behind, a life that had been chosen for her, packaged and sold like a bolt of cloth. She was 19, but she felt as ancient as the cracked earth beneath her worn-out shoes. The sun had been a merciless hammer in a brassy sky, beating down on the plains until the heat shimmered in waves, making the distant, jagged peaks of the mountains dance and blur. Now, that sky was changing. The brass had curdled into a bruised, venomous purple that swallowed the horizon. The air, once heavy with heat, grew still and cold with an unnatural weight. It was the kind of silence that came before violence. Mira pulled the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the structure that had wavered in the heat for the last hour, slowly resolving into something solid. A way station, perhaps, an inn that had long since given up on being inviting. It was little more than a skeleton of a building, slumped against the vast emptiness of the plains. The sign, hanging from one rusted hinge, had been scoured by wind and sun until its words were a ghost's whisper. The traveler's respite. It was a cruel joke. The place looked as if it offered no respite at all, only a place to be forgotten. Paint peeled from the clapboard siding like sunburnt skin, and the porch roof sagged in the middle, as if tired of holding up the sky. But it had a roof, and that was more than Mira had. The first drop of rain wasn't water. It was a hard, white pellet of ice that struck the dusty ground with a sharp tink. Then another, and another. Mira flinched, quickening her pace. Her run was a clumsy, desperate shamble, her breath catching in her throat. Within seconds, the air was full of them, a cascade of ice marbles clattering against the parched earth. They stung her scalp and the backs of her hands. Small, sharp punishments from a sky that had turned against her. She scrambled onto the porch just as the hailstorm unleashed its full fury. The sound was deafening. A furious drumming on the tin roof that vibrated through the warped floorboards and into the soles of her feet. The hailstones grew larger, the size of walnuts now, battering the world into submission. They shredded the leaves of the lone, struggling cottonwood tree and bounced off the packed dirt of the yard like angry spirits. Through the white, churning chaos, Mira saw the world she was fleeing being erased. She wasn't alone. He was sitting on a heavy wooden chair at the far end of the porch, tipped back against the wall, seemingly carved from the shadows themselves. He had been so still that she hadn't seen him at first. A man. The sight sent a familiar bolt of ice through her veins, a cold that had nothing to do with the storm. She froze, one hand gripping the porch post, ready to bolt back into the punishing hail. He didn't move. He simply watched the storm, his posture one of profound indifference. A worn, broad-brimmed hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but she could see the hard line of his jaw and the dark stubble that covered it. He was big, his shoulders broad under a simple chambray shirt, the fabric stretched taut. A gun belt was slung low on his hips, the leather worn smooth with use, the handle of the Colt resting comfortably, naturally, against his thigh. He looked less like a man and more like an extension of the harsh, unforgiving land itself. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the front legs of his chair to the floor with a soft thud. He didn't look at her, not directly. His gaze remained on the maelstrom, but she felt the weight of his awareness. He knew she was there. He knew she was terrified. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the roar of the hail. Mira hugged herself, shivering, the damp calico of her dress clinging to her skin. She had learned the hard way that a man's silence was often a prelude to a demand. She had been taught that her presence in any man's space required payment of some kind, a service, a deference, a piece of herself. She waited for the question. for the cold appraisal in his eyes when he finally turned to look at her. But he didn't. He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out the makings for a cigarette, and began to roll one with a slow, practiced economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. His fingers were long and calloused, sure in their task. He struck a match on the sole of his boot, the flare of it briefly illuminating a face etched with lines that spoke of sun and hardship, and something more, something deeper. His eyes, in that flash of light, were startlingly pale, the color of a winter sky, and they held a distance in them that seemed to stretch further than the plains. He lit the cigarette and took a long, slow drag, the embers glowing red in the deepening gloom. The smell of tobacco, clean and sharp, cut through the scent of wet dust and ozone. It was a simple, human smell, and for some reason, it loosened the knot of fear in Mira's stomach. Just a fraction. He still hadn't spoken. He hadn't even acknowledged her beyond that initial shift of his chair. He was offering her the shelter of his porch, but he was offering her something far rarer. To his indifference. He wasn't looking at her as if she were a stray to be pitied or a prize to be claimed. He was looking through her, past her, at a war only he could see. Mira edged further under the cover of the roof, finding a relatively dry spot near a stack of empty crates. She sank down onto the floorboards, pulling her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. The wood was rough against her cheek, smelling of dust and pine resin. From this vantage point, she could watch him without being obvious. He was a man who knew how to be still. It wasn't the lazy stillness of a man at rest, but the coiled, watchful stillness of a predator or of prey. She couldn't decide which. His movements, when he made them, were minimal and efficient. He moved as if he begrudged every wasted motion, every ounce of squandered energy. She'd seen men like that before, men who had come back from the war between the states, or from skirmishes with the Ute or the Cheyenne. They carried the silence of the battlefield in their bones. It was a silence filled with ghosts. Calder Reese, she would later learn was his name, seemed to have more ghosts than most. He had ridden in with the dawn the 2 days prior, his horse lathered and he himself covered in the dust of a long trail, and had said nothing more than that he was taking over the station for a man who had died of fever. He'd paid the man's debts at the general store in the nearest town and settled into the quiet ruin as if he'd been born to it. The peak of the storm passed. The roar softened to a steady drumming, the hail shrinking back to the size of peas before giving way to a cold, hard rain. Water streamed from the sagging roof in a steady curtain just beyond the porch railing. The world outside was a wash of gray and brown, the red earth turning to a slick, viscous mud. The man, Calder, finished his cigarette, pinching the end and dropping it into a puddle on the steps, where it hissed and died. He still didn't look at Mira. Instead, he stood, his joints cracking softly, and walked to the door of the inn. He disappeared inside, and for a moment, Mira's fear returned threefold. Was he getting a rifle? Was he going to tell her to leave? She tensed, her muscles preparing to run again, though she had no idea where she would go. He returned a moment later, carrying a tin cup that steamed in the cool air. He walked back to his chair, but he didn't sit. He stopped a few feet from her and nudged the cup across the floorboards with the toe of his boot until it came to rest near her hand. Coffee. The rich, bitter aroma reached her, and it was so unexpectedly kind, so deeply comforting, that the tears pricked at the backs of her eyes. She stared at the cup, then up at his shadowed face. His expression was unreadable. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "Go on, drink it." Then he returned to his chair, tipped it back against the wall, and resumed his vigil, staring out at the rain-soaked world. Mira's hands trembled as she reached for the cup. It was hot, searingly so, and the heat sank into her chilled fingers, a small anchor in the swirling chaos of her fear and exhaustion. She took a sip. It was black, strong, and unsweetened. the taste as uncompromising as the man who had given it to her. She drank it slowly, letting the warmth spread through her chest, a temporary truce with the cold that had taken up residence inside her. They sat that way for what felt like an hour, maybe more. The rain gentled, the sky began to lighten in the west, and the world slowly re-emerged from its watery shroud. The silence on the porch was no longer tense. It had settled into something different, a shared space carved out of the storm. He did not ask her name, nor where she came from, nor where she was going. He did not ask what horrors had set her on this road with nothing but the clothes on her back and a terror in her eyes that was as wild as the storm itself. His lack of questions was a greater gift than the coffee. It allowed her, for the first time in days, to simply be, to exist without having to explain or justify or defend herself. The last of the rain whispered away. The only sound was the steady drip of water from the eaves. A single, watery ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, setting the wet world glittering. The air smelled clean, washed, new. It felt like a fresh start. But Mira knew better. The man she was running from, Jedediah Kane, was not the kind of man to give up. He saw her as his property, a deed signed and delivered by her father. He would be hunting for her. The clean air was a lie. The danger was still there, just over the horizon. She had to ask. She couldn't spend the night on a porch, and she couldn't walk through that thick red mud. She had to know if this small, temporary peace could last until morning. She got to her feet, her legs stiff. The empty tin cup felt heavy in her hand. She took a hesitant step toward him, then another. He watched her approach in the reflection of the window pane beside him, his body remaining perfectly still. She stopped before him, clutching the cup like a shield. She looked at his hands, resting on his thighs. They were capable hands, hands that could fix a roof or soothe a horse or end a life with equal efficiency. She swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet air. Her voice, when it came, was a reedy whisper, rusted from disuse and fear. "Sir!" He didn't answer, but his gaze shifted from the window to her face. For the first time, he looked at her fully. His pale eyes weren't cold. She realized they were just empty, as if he had seen so much that there was no room left for surprise or judgment. She had to ask. The words were tangled in her throat, born of a lifetime of being corrected, of being told her every instinct was wrong, her every desire a sin. She was navigating a new world now, a world of her own making, and she had no map. She was terrified of making a mistake that would lead her right back to the cage she had just escaped. Her eyes pleaded with him, asking the question before her lips could form the words. She looked at this silent, watchful stranger, this man who had offered her shelter and warmth without a single word, and she laid her deepest fear at his feet. "Tell me if I do it wrong." His answer was not in words. Calder Reese did not seem a man who had much use for them. He simply held her gaze for a long, unblinking moment, his pale eyes searching hers for something she couldn't name. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod, turned, and pushed open the heavy wooden door to the inn. He didn't invite her to follow, but the gesture was clear. He held the door open, a dark silhouette against the flickering lantern light from within, and waited for Mira. Stepping across that threshold was harder than walking for 3 days under a hostile sun. The world had taught her that a man's roof came with a price, that his door was the opening to a cage. Every instinct, honed by fear and mistreatment, screamed at her to turn and run, to take her chances with the mud and the coming night. But her body, racked with exhaustion and a bone-deep chill, betrayed her. And there was something in his stillness, in the utter lack of demand in his posture, that quieted the screaming in her mind to a dull hum. She took a breath that smelled of rain and wet earth and stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a solid, final thud, shutting out the dripping world. The main room of the inn was cavernous, dominated by a great stone hearth that was black with the soot of 1,000 fires. The air was cool and still, thick with the smells of old wood smoke, stale coffee, and the faint, clean scent of gun oil. It was a man's space, stripped of any softness or comfort. A long, scarred table stood in the center of the room, flanked by a few mismatched, straight-backed chairs. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no pictures on the walls. It was a place meant for passing through, not for living in, and it felt as empty as his eyes. Calder moved past her without a word, his worn boots making soft, rhythmic sounds on the wide plank floor. He knelt before the hearth, his movements economical and sure. He laid a foundation of tinder, added kindling, and then 2 seasoned logs from a nearby wood box. He didn't seem to rush, his hands working with a familiarity that suggested this was a ritual he had performed countless times. A match flared, and the tinder caught, tiny flames licking greedily at the dry wood. The fire grew quickly, a hungry, living thing that began to push back the damp chill and the encroaching shadows. Mira stood by the door, dripping onto the floorboards, feeling utterly out of place. She watched the firelight dance across his broad back, illuminating the worn fabric of his shirt and the powerful lines of his shoulders. He remained crouched by the fire, poking at the logs with an iron poker, his attention entirely consumed by the task. He was creating warmth, creating light, and yet he seemed to have none of it for himself. He rose and turned, his face half in shadow, half in the flickering orange glow. He looked at her then, truly looked, and saw not just a girl, but a soaked, shivering wretch. He saw the way her dark hair was plastered to her scalp and neck, the water trickling down her cheeks like tears. His gaze was clinical, detached, like a man assessing a foundered horse. He walked over to a dark corner of the room and returned with a rough, woolen blanket. It was the color of dust and smelled faintly of hay and the cold night air. He didn't hand it to her. He laid it over the back of the nearest chair. Then he disappeared into a back room, leaving her alone with the crackling fire. The fear, which had been dormant, began to stir again. When he returned, he was carrying a piece of clean, dry cloth. It looked like it might have once been part of a flour sack. Like the blanket, he did not hand it to her directly. He placed it on the chair, on top of the blanket, a silent offering. Then he gestured with his chin toward the fire. The meaning was clear. Get dry, get warm. Mira moved toward the hearth as if in a dream. The heat from the fire was a living presence, wrapping around her, chasing the deep-seated cold from her bones. She sank to the floor before the hearth, her knees weak with relief. She picked up the piece of cloth. It was rough against her skin, but it was dry. She began to towel her hair, the simple, repetitive motion a small comfort. She worked slowly, her eyes on the flames, listening to the man's movements behind her. She heard him walk to a cupboard, the clink of a bottle and a glass, the slosh of liquid. He was on the other side of the room, giving her the entire space in front of the fire, honoring a boundary she hadn't known how to ask for. The small kindnesses were piling up, one on top of the other, and they were beginning to feel heavy. Kindness was a currency she didn't know how to repay, and that frightened her more than overt cruelty, which she understood all too well. When her hair was no longer dripping, she wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The wool was scratchy, but it was thick and warm. She felt a profound, almost painful gratitude. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Calder was sitting at the far end of the long table, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a lantern casting a small pool of yellow light around him. He was cleaning his revolver, the parts laid out on a piece of oiled leather. His focus was absolute, his hand steady as he wiped down each piece of metal, his expression as remote and unreadable as the mountains on the horizon. He seemed to have forgotten she was there. This, she realized, was the safest she had felt in years. To be forgotten, to be invisible. He finished his work on the gun, reassembling it with the same fluid precision he did everything else. He stood, holstered the weapon, and picked up the lantern for a terrifying second. She thought he was going to approach her, that the quiet truce was over, but he walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch, his back to her. "The bedroll by the wall is yours," he said, his voice a low rasp, rough from disuse. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her. The fire should last the night. He looked back then, over his shoulder. He took in the sight of her, huddled in the blanket, her small bare feet tucked beneath her, her face pale in the firelight. He seemed to see something, a flicker of a memory perhaps, because his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked at the heavy canvas coat he wore, a garment stained with the dust of a dozen territories and the grime of hard living. With a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, he shrugged it off. He draped the coat over the back of the chair he had first placed the blanket on. "It gets cold before dawn," he said by way of explanation. Then he opened the door and stepped back out onto the porch, taking the lantern with him and leaving her in the warm, dancing light of the fire. The door clicked shut behind him. Mira stared at the door for a long time, listening. She heard the scrape of his chair on the porch floorboards. He was out there. He was staying out there. He was putting a locked door between them and choosing the cold night for himself. Slowly, she rose and went to the chair where his coat lay. It was heavy. She lifted it, bringing it to her face. It smelled of him of leather, dry tobacco, horses, and the clean, sharp scent of the cold night air. It was not the cloying, perfumed smell of Jedediah Kane, a smell that had always turned her stomach. This was the scent of the wild, of solitude, of a man who was self-contained. It was the scent of safety. She found the bedroll where he said it would be, a simple canvas roll with another wool blanket inside. It was thin, and the floor was hard. But after days of sleeping in ditches and hiding in creek beds, it felt like a feather bed. She lay down, pulling her own blanket tight and laying his heavy coat over the top of it. The weight was comforting, a physical presence that was protective, not threatening. She lay on her side, facing the fire, and watched the flames leap and sway. Every crackle of the logs, every sigh of the settling embers, was a sound of peace. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. She thought of Jedediah's face, his eyes that looked at her as if she were a new mare to be broken, his voice thick with ownership. The memory made her flinch, and she curled into a tighter ball. But then, the scent of the coat would reach her, pulling her back to the present. She thought of the man on the porch. He was a mystery, a man of profound and sorrowful silences. He was maybe dangerous, but she knew, with a certainty that defied all her experience, that he was not a danger to her. He had seen her desperation and had met it not with predation, but with coffee, with a fire, with a blanket, and with distance. Outside on the porch, Calder Reese sat in the dark, staring out at the star-dusted sky that was emerging from behind the tattered clouds. He rolled another cigarette, his hands kneading the familiar motion. He could feel her presence through the thick wooden walls of the house. A girl, young, scared, and running from something bad. It was the story of the West, a story he knew too well. He preferred the cold. He preferred the dark. Inside, by the fire, was a semblance of home, of domesticity, and that was a territory far more dangerous to him than any Cheyenne war party. Home was a place of ghosts. He could still hear his wife's laughter in the crackle of a fire, still see his son's small face in the flickering shadows. Those memories were wounds that had never healed, and he had learned to survive by staying away from anything that might tear them open again. The girl, with her quiet fear and her desperate plea, was a danger to the careful, empty peace he had built for himself. He sat his watch, his eyes on the dark horizon, but his senses were turned inward, toward the quiet breathing of the girl sleeping by his fire. He was guarding her from whatever pursued her through the night, but mostly he was guarding himself from the flicker of warmth she had brought with her into his cold, solitary world. Mira did not know when she fell asleep. She only knew that for the first time in a very long time, she did not dream of running. She dreamt only of the deep, steady crackle of a dying fire and the faint, reassuring scent of leather and dry tobacco. Mira woke to a world of gray and silver. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a soft, pulsing light on the rough-hewn ceiling beams. The air was cold, but the heavy weight of Calder's coat over her blankets had kept the worst of the chill at bay. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. There was no damp earth beneath her, no fear of a sudden noise in the darkness. There was only the scent of wood smoke and the lingering, masculine smell of leather and tobacco from the coat. Then memory returned. A sudden, sharp intake of breath. The storm. The man. His questionless eyes. She sat up, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The inn was silent, save for the soft sigh of the wind outside. He was gone. The thought came with a complex mixture of relief and a strange, hollow disappointment. She was alone again. She pushed herself to her feet, her joints stiff. Her first act was one of ingrained habit, a need to impose order on a small corner of a chaotic world. She carefully folded the blankets from the bedroll, her hands smoothing the coarse wool with precision. She then took his coat, feeling the surprising weight of it, and folded it as well, laying it respectfully over the back of the chair where he had left it. She was a guest here, an uninvited one, and she would not be a burden. She would earn the shelter she had been given. The main room was empty, just as he had left it. She crept to the window and peered out. The world was transformed. The storm had washed the dust from the air, and the morning light was sharp and clean, making the puddles in the yard glitter like fallen pieces of the sky. And there he was. He stood by a large water trough near the barn, stripped to the waist, the pale morning light carving the hard muscles of his back and shoulders. He splashed icy water onto his face and neck, his movements brisk and efficient. A man waking himself up to the reality of another day. Mira pulled back from the window, her cheeks flushing. It felt like an intrusion, watching him in such an unguarded moment. She waited until she heard him move away from the trough before she dared to open the door. The morning air was crisp and cold, smelling of damp earth and pine. Calder was by a small, crackling fire near the porch steps, a blackened coffee pot resting on a grate above the flames. He didn't turn as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her. He simply tilted his head toward a pair of tin cups sitting on the porch railing. The invitation was unspoken, but clear. She poured herself a cup of the steaming black coffee. It was just as strong and bitter as the night before. She stood on the opposite side of the small fire from him, cradling the warm cup in her hands, the silence stretching between them. It wasn't the heavy, watchful silence of the previous night. This was different, a morning silence, clear and simple. He drank his coffee, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, which were now stark and clear against the bluing sky. He seemed a man more comfortable with landscapes than with people. When he finished, he set his cup down and looked at her, his eyes assessing. "There's bacon and hardtack in the larder," he stated, not asked. "If you've a mind to cook." It was a test, she knew. He was offering her a role, a purpose beyond that of a refugee. "I do," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Thank you." The kitchen was as Spartan as the rest of the inn, but it was functional. She found the supplies, and soon the smell of frying bacon filled the small space, a scent of domesticity that felt alien and yet deeply comforting. She worked with a focused intensity, grateful for the simple, honest task. She set 2 plates on the large table in the main room. Calder came in, took his plate without a word, and went back outside to eat on the porch steps. alone. Mira ate at the table. Alone. The distance he kept was as solid and real as a wall. But it was a wall that protected her as much as it isolated him. There were no expectations in that space, no demands. After the simple meal, a new tension settled in. The immediate needs of warmth and food had been met. Now what? She could not stay here forever. She was a liability, a danger he had unknowingly invited into his solitude. She had to contribute, to show him she was not useless. Her eyes fell on the barn. It was a sturdy structure, but like the inn, it showed signs of long neglect. An idea took hold. It was a task she knew, a task that required no conversation. She found a pitchfork leaning against the wall of the inn and walked toward the barn. Calder watched her from the porch, his expression unreadable, but he didn't stop her. The barn door creaked open on rusted hinges, revealing a dusty, shadowed interior. There was only one horse, a powerful-looking buckskin that watched her with intelligent, wary eyes. The stable was in disarray, the old hay soiled and scattered. It was dirty, back-breaking work, but it was something to do. It was a way to pay her debt in sweat, the only currency she possessed. She began to work, her movements becoming more confident as she fell into the familiar rhythm. She scraped the old bedding into a pile, her muscles protesting at the unaccustomed strain. The air grew thick with the smells of ammonia, old hay, and horse. Shafts of sunlight, laden with dancing dust motes, pierced the gloom through cracks in the siding. The buckskin watched her the entire time, occasionally snorting softly, as if offering its opinion on her technique. After a while, it seemed to decide she was no threat, and went back to munching hay from its manger. As she worked, she heard a new sound, the rhythmic thud of a hammer from above. She glanced out the barn door and saw Calder on the roof of the inn, replacing shingles that the hailstorm had torn away. He worked with the same relentless, efficient grace she had seen in all his movements. He was a man who knew how to fix broken things. They were two solitary figures, each absorbed in a task of restoration, their labors a silent conversation. The rhythmic fall of his hammer became the backbeat to the scraping of her pitchfork. The sun climbed higher, and the day grew warm. The clean post-storm air became heavy with the heat of the plains. Mira paused in her work, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her arm. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him. He had taken off his hat, and his dark hair was damp with sweat. Then, with a motion that was purely practical, he shrugged out of his chambray shirt, tossing it onto the peak of the roof, and Mira stopped breathing. His back and shoulders were a map of past violence, a latticework of old scars, white and puckered against the sun-darkened tan of his skin, told a brutal story. There were several round, dimpled scars she knew were from bullets, but there was another, a terrible, sprawling mark across his left shoulder blade, a jagged starburst of raised tissue that could only have come from something meant to tear a man apart. She stared, unable to look away. It was not a morbid fascination. It was a shock of recognition. She, too, had marks on her skin, though hers were smaller, easier to hide. She understood, in a way that went beyond words, what it was to carry the past on your body. She knew the phantom pains, the way a certain touch or a change in the weather could make old wounds ache with memory. In that moment, the distance between them collapsed. He was no longer just a mysterious, silent man. He was a fellow survivor. He must have felt her gaze. He paused in his hammering and looked down, his pale eyes finding hers. He didn't seem surprised or angered by her stare. He followed her gaze to his own shoulder, looking at the scarred flesh as if it belonged to someone else. A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of a pain far older than the scar itself. He didn't need her to ask the question. He could read it in her wide, horrified eyes. He turned back to his work, picking up another shingle. He held it in place, his voice carrying down to her on the warm air. Quiet and matter-of-fact, devoid of any self-pity. "It was worth it," he said, his voice a low rumble. He hammered a nail in with 2 clean, powerful strokes. If it meant someone else lived. And that was all. He offered no more details. He didn't speak of the battle, the chaos, the screams. He didn't name the person whose life had been worth this ruin of his own flesh. The statement hung in the air between them, simple, profound, and absolute. It was the core of his entire being, distilled into a single sentence. He went back to his hammering, the rhythm steady once more. The conversation, as brief and stark as it was, now over. Mira stood in the doorway of the barn for a long time. The pitchfork felt heavy in her hands. She finally understood the emptiness in his eyes. It wasn't emptiness at all. It was a space filled with the ghosts he had paid such a high price to protect. She went back to her work, but something had shifted. The silence that fell between them for the rest of the day was different. Before, it had been the silence of strangers, a lack of things to say. Now, it was a silence filled with what had been said, and all that hadn't. It was a silence of understanding. It was no longer awkward or heavy. It was comfortable, a shared space built on a foundation of recognized pain. They finished their respective tasks as the sun began its long, slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and rose. The stable was clean, smelling of fresh hay. The patch on the roof was neat and solid. They had, together, repaired a small piece of their broken world. That evening, they ate again in their customary way. He on the porch, she at the table. But when she was done, instead of retreating to her bedroll, she took his coat from the chair, walked to the door, and stepped out onto the porch. He looked up from his place on the steps, his expression guarded. She didn't speak. She simply held out the coat to him. He looked at it, then at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than ghosts in his eyes, a flicker of surprise. He took the coat from her, their fingers brushing for a fleeting, electric second. It was the first time they had touched. She retreated back inside without a word, her heart pounding. She lay down on her bedroll, but this time she did not feel the need for the coat's protective weight. The silence from the porch felt different tonight. It was not the silence of a man hiding from himself. It was the silence of a man who had, perhaps for the first time in a long time, been seen, and in being seen, had made her feel safe. A quiet rhythm had established itself in the days that followed. It was a life measured not by conversation, but by the rising and setting of the sun, by the needs of the horse in the barn and the weeds in the small, neglected garden patch behind the inn. They moved around each other in a state of silent, mutual respect. Mira would rise first, coaxing the fire back to life and putting the coffee on. Calder would emerge from the porch where he slept, a man who seemed to prefer a roof of stars to one of shingles. And they would drink their morning coffee by the outdoor fire, 2 solitary figures watching the plains awaken. During the day, they worked. Mira took over the inside of the inn, scrubbing away years of grime, mending old linens she found in a trunk, and tending to the garden, her hands finding solace in the rich, dark earth. Calder worked outside, his days a blur of mending fences, clearing brush, and tending to his horse. He was a man who could only be still when he was in motion, his constant labor a way of holding his own ghosts at bay. They were building a life, not together, but alongside one another, their solitudes running parallel like wagon ruts on a long road. This evening, the air had a chill that promised an early autumn. Mira had made a thin stew from some dried beans and the few wild onions she had managed to find. They ate in their usual manner, in silence. But tonight, Mira did not retreat to her bedroll when the meal was done. She stayed at the table, watching Calder as he sat by the hearth. The firelight cast deep, moving shadows across his face, making him look older, harder. He was sharpening a long, wicked-looking skinning knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic lick of steel on stone the only sound in the room. The sound scraped at her nerves. It was a sound of preparation, of making a tool ready for its purpose. It reminded her of Jedediah Cain, the way he would strop his razor every morning. A slow, deliberate ritual that was all about the careful maintenance of a sharp edge. The memory was a physical thing, a cold knot tightening in her belly. She watched Calder's hands. They were strong, competent hands, calloused from work and weapons, but they were gentle, too. She'd seen the way he handled his horse, a quiet murmur and a soft touch that could calm the big animal in an instant. She thought of his scars, of the life he had given to save another. He was a man who understood pain, a man who knew what it was to be broken and to go on living anyway. And in the warm, flickering safety of the firelight, surrounded by the quiet strength of this man, the words she had held locked inside her for so long began to press against her teeth, demanding to be let out. "My father," she began, her voice so soft it was nearly lost in the sound of the sharpening steel. Calder did not stop. The rhythm of his hands did not falter, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly. He was listening. "He was not a bad man," she continued, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. "Not really, just weak. He had a fondness for drink and for cards, and he was not lucky at either. The debts grew. He had a piece of land, but the drought took the crop for 2 years straight." She paused, the memory of her father's face, crumpled and defeated, rising before her. He had me. I was the only thing he had left that was worth anything. The knife scraped against the stone, a little louder now. "Shh, lick, shh, lick." "Mr. Cain held the notes on my father's land. He was a respected man. My father said, wealthy. He had interests in the mines up north. He told my father that he was looking for a wife, a young one, to give him sons." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. "My father called it a marriage, an arrangement. He said I would have a fine house, silk dresses. He said I would be a fool to refuse such an opportunity. He didn't see that he wasn't offering me an opportunity. He was selling me." She finally looked up at Calder. He was staring into the fire, his profile a hard, unforgiving line. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped along its edge. He still had not spoken, had not even looked at her, but the anger coming off him was a palpable thing, a dry heat that had nothing to do with the fire. "Jedediah Cain," she said, the name a poison on her tongue, "is not a man who buys something without making sure it knows it is owned. The first night, in the fine house my father had promised me, he gave me a wedding gift." She stopped, her own hand unconsciously going to her throat. She could still feel the phantom pressure, the weight of his signet ring, cold against her skin. "He told me that every night, before we slept. He would place his hand here." Her fingers rested in the hollow of her throat. "Just so. He said it was so I would always remember who I belonged to. So I would remember that he held my life. Right there, in his hand. He never had to squeeze. Just the weight of it was enough. The waiting, knowing it was there. I couldn't breathe right until he took it away." The sound of the knife stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Mira looked at Calder. He had lowered his hands, the knife and stone resting on his knee. He was looking at her now, and the emptiness in his eyes was gone. In its place was a cold, murderous rage. It was a still, deep fury, like the heart of a winter storm. It was the most terrifying and the most comforting thing she had ever seen. He was not angry at her for the telling. He was angry for her, for the girl who had had to endure it. He said nothing. There were no words of pity, no empty condolences. Pity was useless. He understood that. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes, she saw the Cheyenne War. She saw the scars on his back. She saw the ghosts he carried, and she knew he understood. Slowly, deliberately, he placed the knife and the stone on the hearth. He stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the entire room, to block out the world. He walked into the dark back room from which he had produced the blanket on the first night. She heard him moving something heavy, the scrape of a wooden box on the floor. He returned, not with words, but with an object. He walked back to the fire and knelt before her, so they were on the same level. He held out his hand. Lying on his calloused palm was a small, two-barreled derringer. It was small enough to fit in a lady's handbag, but the blued steel and the brass fittings gleamed with deadly purpose in the firelight. It was not a toy. He didn't offer it to her. He waited. This was a choice. Her choice. Mira looked from the gun to his face. His expression was grim, resolute. He was not offering her a weapon so he could wash his hands of her. He was offering her a partnership. He was giving her the one thing Jedediah Cain had tried to take away: power. Her hand trembled as she reached out and took the gun. It was heavier than it looked, a solid, dense weight in her palm. The metal was cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of the fire. She curled her fingers around the smooth wooden grip. It felt strange, alien, but it also felt right. It was a period at the end of a long, terrible sentence. Calder's voice was low, a gravelly whisper that was more potent than any shout. "It's loaded. Both barrels. You pull the hammer back and you pull the trigger. It's not a rifle. You have to be close, but it'll do the job." He looked at her, his pale eyes boring into hers, impressing the importance of his next words upon her very soul. "If they come looking," he said, and there was no doubt who they were, "you'll know what to do with it." He stood then, his part in the transaction complete. He picked up his skinning knife from the hearth, tested the edge with his thumb, and slid it back into the sheath on his belt. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "Bolt the door behind me," he said, without looking back. Then he was gone, leaving her alone once more, the door closing with a soft click behind him. Mira sat before the fire for a long time, the little gun resting in her lap. She listened as Calder's footsteps crossed the porch and faded into the night. She rose and, for the first time, slid the heavy iron bolt across the door, the sound of it shooting home a deep, satisfying thud. She returned to the fire, the derringer still in her hand. The weight of it was a comfort. It was a terrible comfort, but it was real. Calder hadn't offered her empty platitudes. He hadn't promised that everything would be all right. He had looked at the ugly, brutal truth of her past and had given her a tool to face the future. He had not treated her like a victim. He had armed her like a soldier, and as she sat there, the firelight glinting on the cold steel, Mira realized that for the first time in her life, she was not just a girl who was running away. She was a woman who was ready to stand her ground. The little derringer was a cold, dense secret in the dark. Mira had wrapped it in a piece of spare cloth and placed it beside her bedroll, within easy reach. Its presence did not bring her the simple comfort she had hoped for. Instead, it was a constant, physical reminder of the world she had fled, and the violence that might one day find her again. To own such a thing was to admit that the world was a place where you might need to use it. The weight of it was the weight of a life. Perhaps her own, perhaps another's. It was a heavy thing to sleep beside. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a deep, hypnotic red glow, pulsing like a tired heart. Outside, the vast, high plains were awash in the pale, indifferent light of 1,000 stars. There was no moon. The silence was absolute, a living presence that pressed in on the small, lonely inn. In this profound quiet, every fear, every memory, had room to breathe and grow. Mira lay on her back, staring up at the shadowed ceiling, her mind replaying the conversation with Calder. The act of speaking the truth about Jedediah Cain had been like lancing a wound. There was a clean, sharp pain in the release, but now the poison was out, exposed to the air, and the wound felt raw and tender. She could still feel the phantom weight of Cain's hand on her throat, a pressure that was more memory than sensation. She could hear the quiet confidence in his voice when he called her his property. She turned onto her side, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin. She thought of Calder, out on the porch, a silent guardian keeping watch. The knowledge of his presence was a small, steady flame in the overwhelming darkness of her fear. He had not offered her pity. He had offered her respect. He had looked upon her shame and had not flinched. He had armed her. Trust was a foreign country she had never expected to visit. Yet here she was, cautiously stepping across its border. With that thought, a fragile peace settled over her, and she finally drifted into the treacherous country of sleep. And the darkness she had been running from rose up to claim her. It began not with a sight, but with a smell, the cloying, sweet scent of bay rum mixed with the bitter smoke of an expensive cigar. It was the smell of Jedediah Kane's study, the smell of the cage where he had kept her, in the dream. The scent was a thick, oily fog that filled her lungs, making it impossible to breathe. She was standing in a room with no doors and no windows, the walls made of a polished, suffocating darkness. A sound echoed in the black space, the sharp, metallic click of a key turning in a lock that she could not see. The sound was a pronouncement of doom, the final closing of a trap. She was his. There was no escape. She tried to run, but her feet were mired in something thick and cold, a black, viscous mud that sucked at her ankles, pulling her down. With every frantic step, she only sank deeper. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of the dream. She was trapped. She was sinking. Then came the voice. It was not a shout, but a calm, proprietary whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was Kane's voice, smooth and cultured, the voice of a man who never had to raise it to be obeyed. Mine. The word was a brand on her soul. You are my property. Mira, did you really think you could run from what you are? She opened her mouth to scream, to deny it, but the thick, sweet air filled her throat, choking the sound back down. She was voiceless, powerless. The mud was at her knees now, cold and heavy. And then she felt the touch. It started on her shoulder, a heavy, deliberate pressure. It wasn't a human hand. It was impossibly heavy, made of cold stone, a piece of a statue. The weight of it was immense, crushing. It began to slide, slow and inexorable, from her shoulder up to her neck, tracing the path she dreaded above all others. It was his claim, his mark of ownership. Nowhere to run, the voice whispered, laced with a cold amusement. The stone hand settled into the hollow of her throat. The weight grew, pressing down, cutting off the last of her air. The darkness of the room began to spin, the pinpricks of light in her vision winking out one by one. She was suffocating. She was dying. The gun, a desperate, rational part of her mind, screamed. The gun! She fought against the mud, against the crushing weight, trying to reach for the derringer that she knew was beside her, but her arms were heavy, useless appendages trapped in the mire. There was no gun. There was no Calder. There was only the darkness, the voice, and the crushing, final weight of his hand. Mira awoke with a violent, shuddering gasp. Her own scream was trapped in her throat, a strangled, tearing sound. For a terrifying second, the dream held on. The dark room of the inn was the prison of her nightmare. The dying embers of the fire were Kane's cigar, glowing in the blackness. The blanket was the mud, pinning her down. The weight on her neck was real. She thrashed, clawing at her own throat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The scream finally broke free, a raw, ragged sound of pure animal terror. She scrambled out of the bedroll, kicking the blankets away, and staggered to her feet. The room was spinning. The walls were closing in. She wasn't safe. It wasn't real. She had to get out. She stumbled toward the door, her only thought to escape the suffocating confines of the inn. Her fumbling hands found the heavy iron bolt. It felt like the lock in her dream. She wrenched it back, the sound of the metal scraping in its housing unnaturally loud in the silence. She threw the door open and burst out into the night. The cold air was a shock, a slap in the face that did nothing to quell the panic. The world was a dizzying panorama of stark, unfamiliar stars. She took 2, 3 blind, Running steps onto the dusty ground and her legs tangled beneath her. She fell, hard, the impact driving the last of the air from her lungs. She landed on her hands and knees, the sharp grit of the earth digging into her palms, the pain a sudden, bright flare. She stayed there, kneeling in the dirt, her head hanging, trying to draw a breath. She was no longer screaming, but her body was racked with deep, silent sobs, the aftershocks of a terror too deep for sound. The nightmare was fading, but the feeling of it, the cold certainty of being owned and trapped, clung to her like a shroud. She heard a sound behind her, the soft scuff of a boot in the dust. Her head snapped up, her body tensing, ready to flee again. A dark figure stood in the doorway of the inn, a tall silhouette against the faint red glow from the hearth. Calder. He didn't move for a long moment. He stood there, a silent sentinel, letting the night absorb the first violent waves of her terror. He did not rush to her, did not call her name. He simply watched, his stillness a stark contrast to the chaos that was raging inside her. He was giving her space, letting her find her own ground. Then, he began to move toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. Not the advance of a threat, but the approach of a cautious man near a frightened animal. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for his presence to be felt, but far enough not to be confining. He stood over her, a mountain of silent strength in the vast, empty night. Mira knelt in the dust, her breathing still coming in ragged, painful gasps. She felt his shadow fall over her and she flinched, curling in on herself, waiting for the hand to fall, for the voice to condemn her for her weakness. He did not speak. He lowered himself down, not looming over her, but kneeling beside her in the dust. He was a dark shape in her peripheral vision, a quiet presence that asked for nothing. They stayed that way for what felt like an eternity. Two kneeling figures under the cold, distant stars. The silence broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing slowly returning to normal. When the last of the shudders had passed through her, he finally moved. He lifted his hand, slowly, so she could see the motion. He reached out and gently, tentatively, placed it on her shoulder. It was nothing like the hand in her dream. It wasn't heavy or cold. It was warm, the heat of it sinking through the thin fabric of her nightdress. It was firm, steady, a touch that did not seek to claim or to control, but simply to anchor. It was the touch of a man who knew the landscape of nightmares, who had walked through his own private hells. It was a touch that said, without words, "I am here. You are not alone." His voice, when it came, was a low, quiet rumble, barely disturbing the stillness of the night. It was rough, like stones rolling in a slow river, but it was gentle. "There's no wrong or right," he said softly. His words aimed not at her ears, but at the heart of her fear. "Not tonight." He paused, his thumb moving in a slow, soothing circle on her shoulder. "There's just you, breathing, and that's enough." The words were simple. They were not a promise that everything would be all right, or an assurance that her fears were unfounded. They were a simple, profound statement of fact. Her life, her breath, was enough. Her survival was its own justification. In a world that had tried to tell her she was worthless, a thing to be sold and used, he was telling her that her very existence was a victory. The knot of terror that had been lodged in her chest for years, for a lifetime, finally began to loosen. The tears that had been frozen inside her began to fall, hot and silent, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. They were not tears of fear or of sadness. They were tears of a release so profound it left her weak. Slowly, she lifted her head. She turned to look at him, her vision blurred by the tears. His face was in shadow, but she could see the grim set of his mouth and the deep, somber understanding in his pale eyes as they caught the starlight. He was not a savior. He was not a hero. He was just a man, scarred and broken in his own right, who had seen her pain and had not turned away. And as Mira looked at Calder Reese, kneeling beside her in the cold dirt of the Colorado plains, she realized that for the very first time, she was looking at him without a single shred of fear. The night of the dream had changed something fundamental between them. The silence that now settled over the inn in the evenings was no longer a void, but a shared territory. A fragile peace had taken root in the dust. Mira found herself humming as she worked in the garden, a small, half-forgotten tune from her childhood. Calder, in turn, seemed less like a ghost haunting the edges of the property. He would sometimes sit on the porch steps in the evening, cleaning a piece of tack, while she sat in the doorway, mending a shirt. They were like two planets that had fallen into a strange, silent orbit around the small, steady gravity of the inn. The fear in her had not vanished, but it had receded, becoming a distant country she no longer had to live in every day. It was in the late afternoon of one such quiet day that the peace was shattered. The sun was low, slanting long, golden fingers of light across the plains. A soft breeze whispered through the cottonwood leaves. Mira was on her knees in the garden patch, her hands covered in rich, dark soil, a smudge of it on her cheek. Calder was by the barn, methodically oiling his saddle, his movements as rhythmic and predictable as a clock. The sound came first, a low, discordant note in the symphony of the plains, a rhythmic thudding, too faint to be thunder, too persistent to be the wind. Calder went still. His hands stopped their work, his head coming up, his entire body a study in coiled, listening tension. He was like a deer that had scented a wolf on the wind. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping the vast, empty horizon to the east. Mira saw the change in him, and her blood went cold. She rose slowly from the dirt, her heart beginning a low, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She followed his gaze, her eyes straining. At first, she saw nothing but the endless stretch of grass and sky. Then she saw them, three dark specks, moving in unison, resolving slowly out of the heat haze. Riders. They were not moving like weary travelers. There was an unnerving purpose to their pace, a straight, undeviating line aimed directly at the inn. Mira. Calder's voice cut through the quiet air. It was low, calm, but it held a new and terrible authority. Go inside. Bolt the door. Stay away from the windows. She didn't question him. The fragile peace had evaporated, and the old, familiar fear was back, sharp and metallic in her mouth. She ran to the inn, her skirts catching on the dry brush. She fumbled with the door, threw herself inside, and slammed the heavy iron bolt home. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the small derringer she retrieved from its hiding place. She crept to the edge of the grimy front window, peering through a small, clear patch in the corner, her heart pounding in time with the approaching hoofbeats. Calder had not moved. He stood in the open, halfway between the porch and the barn, his saddle forgotten on its stand. He was waiting, a solitary, unmovable figure. As the riders drew closer, she could make them out. The man in the lead was dressed in a dark, townish suit, a bowler hat on his head. He looked out of place, a crow amongst buzzards. The two men who flanked him were of a different breed entirely. They were hard-faced and unshaven, their clothes worn and dusty, their gun belts slung low and tied down. They were hired men, their eyes cold and empty. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from Calder, their mounts nervous and blowing. Sensing the tension in the air, the man in the suit, who seemed to be the leader, looked around at the dilapidated inn with a contemptuous sneer. "Quite the place you've got here," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. It was a smooth, oily voice, the kind of voice used to giving orders and being obeyed. "We're looking for a girl, a runaway?" Calder remained silent, his hands loose at his sides. He let the man talk, his pale eyes moving slowly, deliberately from one rider to the next, assessing them, weighing them. "Her name is Mira Kane," the man continued, patting his horse's neck. "Wife of Mr. Jedediah Kane, a very important man. She took it into her head to go for a little stroll, and we've been sent to escort her home." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. He made a show of opening it, holding it up for Calder to see. "We have the marriage certificate, all legal and proper." From her hiding place, Mira felt a wave of nausea. The paper, the lie that had bound her. The signature on it was her father's, not hers, but in the eyes of the law, that made no difference. Calder didn't even glance at the paper. His gaze was fixed on the man in the suit. "There's no one here by that name," he said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. The man's smile tightened. "Now, friend, let's not make this difficult. We know she's here. A stable boy in the last town saw a girl matching her description heading this way. Just send her out, and we'll be on our way. Mr. Kane is a generous man. He'll even compensate you for your trouble." "I told you," Calder said, his voice dropping even lower, taking on a dangerous edge. "She's not here. You'd best be riding on." One of the hired guns shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting down to rest on the butt of his pistol. "He ain't askin'," the man growled. The man in the suit held up a hand, silencing him. "There's no need for unpleasantness. This is a simple matter of property. The girl is the legal property of her husband." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Look, Cowboy, I don't know what she told you, but she's a liar and a thief. She stole from him. You don't want to get yourself caught in the middle of a family affair." "She's not going anywhere," Calder repeated, the words as final as a gravestone. The last of the false pleasantries fell away from the lead man's face, replaced by a mask of cold fury. He had not expected this level of resistance from a lone man at a ruined way station. He had expected a simple transaction. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "A fatal one. That girl belongs to another man." And then Calder moved. It was not a large movement. He simply shifted his weight, planting his feet more firmly in the dust. A man taking his stand. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it resonated with a terrible, absolute conviction that cut through the air and silenced the wind itself. "She is not a thing." The words were a declaration of war. Inside the inn, Mira's hand tightened on the derringer. She is not a thing. No one had ever said that about her before. No one had ever seen her as anything more than an object, a possession, a commodity. The words were a shield, a sword. They were a gift more precious than her life. And she knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that he was going to die for them. Outside, the three men dismounted, their movements slow and deliberate. They fanned out, their intentions clear. The man in the suit drew a fancy-looking revolver from a shoulder holster, while the other two unholstered their own well-worn pistols. The sun glinted off the polished metal. The air grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. "Last chance, Cowboy," the man in the suit said, his voice tight. "Give us the girl." Calder didn't answer. His entire being was focused, narrowed down to this single, deadly moment. His eyes, pale and cold, darted between the three men, calculating angles, measuring distances. He was one man against three. The odds were impossible. The world seemed to slow down. Mira could hear the frantic beating of her own heart, the creak of saddle leather, the soft, nervous stamp of a horse's hoof. She saw a bead of sweat trace a path through the dust on the cheek of one of the hired guns. She saw the man's knuckles whiten as he gripped his pistol. The man on the right twitched. It was a small, nervous gesture, a shifting of his weight, but it was enough. It was as if time itself broke. Calder's hand was a blur, a streak of motion that seemed to defy possibility. The sound of his coat clearing the leather was a dry, snakeskin whisper, immediately followed by the loud, mechanical click-clack of the hammer being cocked. But the first shot came from the nervous man. He fired wildly, overcome by the tension, the bullet kicking up a spray of dust a foot to Calder's left. The sound of the gunshot was a physical blow, a deafening roar that shattered the afternoon's peace. A flock of birds exploded from the cottonwood tree, shrieking in terror. The horses screamed and reared, their eyes wide with panic. And then Calder fired. His shot was not wild. It was deliberate, aimed, and final. The nervous man who had fired first was thrown backward as if struck by a giant, invisible fist. He hit the ground with a heavy, boneless thud and did not move again. All hell broke loose. The air was filled with the thunderous, rolling boom of gunfire. Black powder smoke, acrid and sulphurous, billowed out, obscuring the scene in a thick, gray fog. Another bullet splintered the porch post, inches from where Mira was hiding, showering her with sharp slivers of wood. She cried out, stumbling back from the window, her heart seizing in her chest. She could hear the chaos outside, men shouting curses, the panicked, high-pitched whinny of a wounded horse, and the steady, terrifyingly calm report of Calder's Colt, firing with a measured, deadly rhythm. Boom! 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 Each shot was an answer. Each shot was a punctuation mark at the end of his declaration. She is not a thing. Mira scrambled to her feet, her back pressed against the wall, the tiny derringer feeling useless and absurdly small in her trembling hand. She was the cause of this smoke, this blood, this death. It was all her fault. The terror was a paralyzing, icy hand, but beneath it, a new and unfamiliar emotion was beginning to burn, a hot, helpless rage. She crept back to the window, peering through the swirling smoke. She could see one of the hired guns using the water trough for cover, firing blindly toward the inn. The man in the suit was nowhere to be seen. And then she saw Calder. He was no longer in the open. He had moved, using the corner of the barn for cover, but he was moving slowly, favoring his left side. As the smoke cleared for a brief second, she saw the dark, wet stain spreading across his shirt, just below his ribs. He was hit! The world tilted on its axis. The night of her dream crashed back into her, but this time it was real. The darkness was the swirling smoke. The suffocating pressure was the roar of the guns. And the man who had told her that her own breathing was enough was now bleeding in the dust for her. The sight of the dark stain spreading across Calder's shirt was a lit match dropped on a trail of gunpowder. The ice of Mira's fear shattered, and in its place, a white-hot rage ignited. It was a fury so pure and absolute it burned away every shred of her hesitation, every whisper of the voice that told her she was weak and helpless. He was hurt. He was bleeding in the dust for her. This would not stand. The derringer in her hand was no longer a foreign object. It felt like an extension of her own will, a conduit for the fire that was now consuming her. The world outside the window, which moments before had been a terrifying panorama of chaos. Narrowed down to a single point of focus, the man crouched behind the water trough, the one whose bullets were tearing splinters from the wall that sheltered her. She slid the bolt back on the door. The sound was lost in the deafening thunder of another gunshot from outside. She didn't throw the door wide open. Some primal instinct for survival kept her low, using the heavy wooden door frame as a shield. She peered around the edge, her body trembling not with fear, but with a violent, consuming adrenaline. There he was, the second hired gun. He was reloading, fumbling with cartridges, his face a mask of sweat and concentration, his attention fixed on the corner of the barn where Calder had taken cover. He did not see her. He did not know she existed. Mira raised the small pistol. It felt impossibly heavy. Her arms shook, and the barrel wavered. She remembered Calder's words. "You have to be close." She was close enough. She thumbed back the hammer, the click of it shockingly loud to her own ears. She closed her eyes for a second, took a ragged breath, and then opened them, forcing the wavering barrel to settle on the dark shape of the man's back. She did not think about his name, or his life, or the fact that he was a man at all. She thought only of the spreading red stain on Calder's shirt. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow. The derringer bucked in her hand with a violence that shocked her. The sound, a deafening, painful crack right next to her head. The recoil sent a stinging shockwave up her arm. Acrid. White smoke billowed from the barrel, blinding her, filling her nose and mouth with its sulphurous taste. Through the smoke, she heard a sharp, grunting cry of pain, followed by a clatter of metal on wood as the man's pistol fell from his grasp. When the smoke cleared a fraction, she saw him staggering away from the trough, clutching his shoulder, his face contorted in a mask of shock and agony. Her shot hadn't been fatal, but it had found its mark. He was out of the fight. The entire dynamic of the battle shifted in that instant. The man in the suit, Harlan, who had been trying to get a clear shot at Calder from behind a nervous horse, saw his second man go down. He saw the new threat, the impossible phantom that had appeared in the doorway of the inn. His face, which had been a mask of determined cruelty, crumpled into something else entirely: fear. This was no longer a simple matter of retrieving property. This was a bloodbath. He wasn't being paid enough to die in the dust of some forgotten way station. He scrambled for the reins of his horse, his movements clumsy with panic. He threw himself into the saddle, kicking the animal's flanks mercilessly. The wounded man, seeing his leader deserting him, let out a panicked cry and began to stumble after him, one arm hanging uselessly at his side. Their retreat was a frantic, cowardly scramble, a stark contrast to their arrogant arrival. A final, deliberate shot boomed from the corner of the barn. It wasn't aimed at the fleeing men. The bullet kicked up a puff of dust just behind the hooves of Harlan's horse, a final, contemptuous punctuation mark on their defeat. The animal screamed in terror and bolted, carrying its master away into the twilight as if pursued by the devil himself. The wounded man was left behind, staggering after them, a pathetic, dwindling figure against the vast, darkening plains. And then silence. It descended like a shroud, a silence that was heavier, more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the high-pitched ringing in Mira's ears, the coppery smell of blood on the air, and the thick, choking scent of gunpowder. The world was still, painted in the bloody hues of the setting sun. One man lay dead in the yard. Two had fled. The battle was over. The derringer fell from Mira's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the wooden porch. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over her, and she gripped the door frame to keep from falling. The rage that had sustained her drained away, leaving her hollowed out, trembling and cold. She looked at the dead man, a sprawled, broken thing that no longer seemed human. She looked at her own hands, shaking uncontrollably. She had fired a gun. She had shot a man. Her gaze snapped to the barn. Calder. He was still leaning against the wall, but he was slowly sliding down, his legs giving way. He was a dark shape in the growing gloom. Calder. His name was a torn, desperate sound from her throat. She ran to him, stumbling over the uneven ground, her skirts catching on the very weeds she had been tending just an hour before. She fell to her knees beside him as he finally slumped to the ground, his back against the rough wood of the barn. His face was pale, almost gray in the fading light, and slick with a cold sweat. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and ragged. "No, no, no," she whispered, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch him, afraid of the damage she might find. The dark stain on his shirt had grown, a ghastly, spreading flower. His eyes flickered open. They were cloudy with pain, but they found hers. "Just a scratch," he rasped, the words a blatant, terrible lie. A small, grim smile touched his lips before turning into a grimace of pain. "We have to get you inside," she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. The girl who had been paralyzed by fear was gone, replaced by a woman with a purpose. Getting him to the inn was a nightmare of dead weight and agonizing, slow progress. He tried to help, tried to get his feet under him, but his strength was gone. She had to loop his arm over her shoulders, half dragging, half carrying him, his staggering weight threatening to crush her. Every pained grunt and sharp intake of breath from him was a knife in her heart. He was bleeding for her. He was dying for her. She finally got him through the door and onto her bedroll by the hearth, the only soft place in the entire inn. He collapsed onto it with a low groan, his body shivering despite the warmth of the room. The fire had burned low, and the room was filled with shadows that danced and writhed like evil spirits. She worked on instinct, her mind a clear, cold place where panic had no room. She stoked the fire, adding logs until it blazed to life, pushing back the darkness. She lit a lantern, its steady yellow glow a small beacon of order in the chaos. She would need water and cloth, clean cloth. She found a knife in the kitchen and returned to his side. She knelt beside him, her heart pounding. "I have to cut your shirt," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. He gave a short, sharp nod, his eyes squeezed shut, his jaw clenched against the pain. Her hands trembled as she sliced through the rough fabric, revealing the wound beneath. It was on his left side, a ragged, ugly tear in his flesh, low on his ribs. It was bleeding sluggishly, the blood dark and thick. It wasn't a clean hole. The bullet had torn through, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was bad. She ran to the water pump, her feet pounding on the floorboards, and filled a bucket, her movements frantic. She tore strips from the cleanest linen she could find, the one she had painstakingly mended just the day before. Cleaning the wound was the hardest thing she had ever done. Every touch made him flinch, a low sound of agony rumbling in his chest, though he never cried out. She washed away the blood, her stomach churning, forcing herself to be thorough, to be clinical. She had to stop the bleeding. She folded a thick pad of cloth and pressed it hard against the wound. He let out a sharp, hissing breath through his teeth, his whole body going rigid, but he did not push her away. She held the pressure, her arms aching, tears of helplessness and fury streaming down her face, dripping onto his bare chest. The blood was still seeping through, turning the white linen a ghastly pink, then a spreading red. It wasn't working. He was going to die, right here, on her bedroll, in front of this fire, and it would be her fault. A deep, shuddering sob broke from her, a sound of utter despair. She was failing him. And then she felt a touch. His right hand, which had been clenched into a fist at his side, slowly uncurled. He lifted it, the movement a testament to a will of pure iron. His hand was smeared with his own blood, but his touch was impossibly gentle as he laid his fingers against her tear-streaked cheek. She stopped sobbing, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at him, her eyes wide. His face was a mask of pain, but his eyes were open, and they were clear. They were fixed on her, and in their pale depths. She saw not accusation, not blame, but an ocean of something else, something fierce and protective and unwavering. He saw the guilt in her eyes, the self-loathing, the fear that she had done everything wrong. He saw the question there, the one she was too terrified to ask, and he answered it. His voice was a dry, ragged whisper, strained and weak, but the words were the strongest things she had ever heard. "Mira," he breathed her name. "Even if you do it wrong." He paused, drawing a shallow, painful breath. His bloody fingers tightened ever so slightly on her cheek, holding her gaze, holding her there. "I'm still here." The words were an absolution. They were a promise. They were an anchor in the swirling, bloody chaos of the world. He was not telling her she was right. He was telling her that right and wrong did not matter. What mattered was that they were here, together, in the aftermath. He was telling her that he had made his choice, and he would not forsake it. She leaned into his touch, her tears falling onto his hand, mingling with his blood. The firelight flickered and danced, casting their two shadows, intertwined and inseparable, against the wall, outside, The plains were dark and silent, hiding the dead man in their embrace. But inside the small, broken inn, a fragile, terrible, and beautiful thing had just been forged in blood and silence. The hours that followed the retreat of the hunters were a surreal, waking nightmare. The sun set, plunging the plains into a darkness that seemed to swallow the last echoes of the gunshots. The only light was the nervous, flickering glow from the hearth, and the only sound was Calder's shallow, labored breathing. The dead man still lay in the yard, a dark shape the coyotes would soon find, a grim testament to the price of Mira's freedom. The first night was a desperate, primal battle fought not with guns, but with boiled water, clean cloth, and a relentless will. Calder's promise, "I'm still here," became a command that Mira clung to as he began to slip away from her. A fever took hold, a dry, insidious heat that radiated from his skin. He began to shiver violently, his teeth chattering, his strong body suddenly frail and racked with tremors. He was no longer the silent, immovable protector. He was a vulnerable man, lost in the burning labyrinth of his own pain. Mira fought the fever with a fierce desperation. She bathed his face and chest with cool water, the act an intimate, terrifying prayer. She forced sips of water between his cracked lips, whispering his name, trying to tether him to the world of the living. He began to talk, his voice a low, broken mumble, his words the fragmented wreckage of a past she could not comprehend. He spoke of dust and smoke, of the rosebud, of a man named Custer. He cried out names she didn't know, Elias. Jacob, his voice thick with an ancient, unbearable sorrow. He was not in the inn with her. He was back in the war, reliving the moments that had carved the scars into his soul and his skin. She listened to his delirious ramblings, her heart aching with a pain that was separate from her fear. She was seeing the ghosts that lived behind his pale, empty eyes. She was witnessing the source of his profound solitude. She sat by his side, a lone sentinel in the long, dark hours, her hand resting on his forehead, as if she could physically hold him back from the darkness that was trying to claim him. Days bled into a timeless, exhausting rhythm. The world shrank to the confines of the inn, to the space around the bedroll where Calder fought his war. Mira's life became a series of simple, essential tasks. Stoke the fire, boil the water, clean the wound, change the bandage, force broth between his lips, sleep, in brief, dreamless snatches, in a chair by the hearth, the little derringer always on the table beside her. The inn, once his domain, was now hers. She moved through it with a quiet, desperate purpose. She learned the language of his pain, the slight tensing of his jaw that meant the wound was throbbing, the restless shifting that preceded a spike in his fever. She learned the topography of his body, the hard ridges of muscle, the shocking heat of his skin, the landscape of his scars. She saw him at his most vulnerable, stripped of his strength, his silence, his armor, and in his weakness, she found a strength she never knew she possessed. After 3 days, the fever broke. She awoke from a shallow sleep to find him watching her, his eyes clear for the first time. The burning heat was gone from his skin. He was weak, his face gaunt, but he was lucid. He was there. He had come back. Neither of them spoke. Words were inadequate for what had passed between them. He had seen her terror, and she had now seen his ghosts. They had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He simply held her gaze, and in his eyes she saw a raw, unguarded gratitude that was more eloquent than any words could ever be. She gave a small, tremulous smile, and the single tear that escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek was one of pure, unadulterated relief. His recovery was a slow, arduous journey. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now. It was rich and deep, layered with the shared knowledge of the battle they had fought, both outside in the dust and inside in the fevered darkness. They did not speak of the gunfight, They did not speak of the dead man who had long since vanished from the yard, claimed by the plains. They did not need to. The event was a dark star around which their new lives now revolved. Its gravity felt in every shared glance, every quiet gesture. As his strength began to return, a new reality set in. The work of the way station, the relentless, daily tasks required for survival, did not stop, and Calder could not do them. The responsibility fell to Mira. It began with the horse, the buckskin, a powerful animal named Dust Devil, needed to be exercised. He had grown restless and ill-tempered from being cooped up in the barn. "You'll have to ride him," Calder said one afternoon, his voice still rough. He was sitting on the porch steps, his left arm in a crude sling she had fashioned, his face pale but determined. Mira's stomach twisted with fear. She had only ever ridden in a carriage or on the back of a slow, plodding farm mule. Dust Devil was a creature of barely contained power and spirit. "I don't know how," she whispered. "I'll teach you," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The first lessons were a clumsy, terrifying ordeal. He talked her through it from the porch, his voice calm and steady, telling her how to approach the horse, how to speak to it, how to place the blanket and the heavy saddle. The animal seemed to sense her fear, shifting and snorting, its large, intelligent eyes watching her every move. The first time she managed to haul herself into the saddle, she felt impossibly high off the ground, a fragile passenger on a mountain of muscle. But she persevered. Every day, she would lead the horse out, and with Calder's quiet instructions guiding her, she would ride. At first, it was just a shaky walk around the yard, then a trot, and then, one afternoon, she felt a shift, a connection. She urged the horse into a canter, and the animal responded, stretching its powerful legs, the rhythm of its gait becoming a part of her. The wind tore at her hair, the vast plains opened up before her, and for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of exhilarating, absolute freedom. She was no longer a prisoner. She was no longer running. She was flying. The next lesson was in the art of survival. "We're low on cartridges," Calder stated one evening, watching her clean the derringer, an act that had become a nightly ritual. The following day, he had her bring out his reloading tools. On the big table inside the inn, he laid out the gleaming brass casings, the soft, heavy lead slugs, the tins of black powder, and the tiny, delicate percussion caps. He showed her how to measure the powder, how to seat the bullet, how to fix the cap. It was a meticulous, dangerous craft, where a single mistake could have disastrous consequences. Her hands, which had once been soft and pale, were now becoming calloused and competent. She worked slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration, the scent of powder and lead filling the air. As she filled the empty casings one by one, she felt another shift inside her. She was no longer just a victim of violence. She was learning its language, its mechanics. She was taking control, building the very tools that would ensure her own survival. As Calder grew strong enough to walk around the yard, he began to direct her in the final stage of her transformation. "The fence by the south pasture is down," he said. "A storm took it out last spring. Needs fixing." Mending a fence was the hardest work she had ever known. She had to dig new post holes in the sun-baked, rock-hard earth, the shock of the post hole digger jarring her all the way up to her shoulders. She learned to stretch the sharp, unforgiving barbed wire, her hands and arms accumulating a lattice of new scratches and scars. The sun beat down on her, darkening her skin, and the wind chapped her lips and cheeks. She worked from dawn until dusk, her body aching with a fatigue so deep it went into her bones, but it was a good ache. It was the ache of accomplishment, of building something real and lasting with her own two hands. A fence was a line drawn in the dirt. It was a declaration. This land is ours. This space is protected. Trespassers are not welcome. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting the plains in a soft, purple light, Calder stood on the porch, leaning against a post. no longer needing the sling. He watched as Mira rode Dust Devil back toward the barn. She no longer looked like a frightened girl from back east. She sat the horse with an easy, confident grace, her hair tied back in a simple knot, her face smudged with the dirt and sweat of a hard day's work. She looked strong. She looked free. She looked like she belonged here. She reined in the horse and swung down from the saddle, her movements fluid and sure. She looked up at him and smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. He didn't smile back, but the hard lines around his mouth softened. He gave a slow, deliberate nod of approval. In that silent, shared moment, the entire world seemed to settle into place. The fevered nightmares, the smoke and the blood, had been a baptism by fire. His physical wounds were healing, the angry red of the scar on his side slowly fading. But more importantly, the invisible wounds they both carried were beginning to scar over as well, replaced by a tough, resilient strength. Forged in the quiet, unrelenting forge of the plains, she was no longer a runaway seeking shelter, and he was no longer a ghost. Hiding from the world, they were two survivors, standing on a small patch of land they had, together, decided to call home. The weeks after Calder's recovery settled into a new kind of quiet. Autumn had arrived on the plains, a slow, beautiful death that painted the grasses in shades of pale gold and rust. The air grew sharp and clean, with a brittle chill in the mornings that hinted at the coming winter. The violent ghosts of the gunfight had receded, leaving behind an indelible mark on the landscape of their lives, but no longer haunting their every waking moment. The silence between them was no longer a space to be cautiously navigated. It had become their native language. Their life was a tapestry woven from two separate, parallel threads. He spent his days preparing the way station for the cold, his axe ringing out in the crisp air as he chopped and stacked a formidable wall of firewood. He re-chinked the walls of the inn with fresh mud and straw, his movements once again imbued with their old, efficient strength. The scar on his side was a puckered, angry red line, a permanent reminder of his choice, but it no longer pained him. Mira, in turn, had claimed her own domain. She managed the inside of the inn, the garden, and the small flock of chickens she had acquired on a rare trip to the nearest town with Calder. She had learned to preserve the last of the garden's bounty. The shelves of the larder now lined with jars of pickled vegetables and dried herbs. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and capable, as competent with a needle or a hoe as they were with the mechanisms of a firearm. The sun had browned her skin, and the wind had put a permanent flush in her cheeks. The haunted, hunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a calm, steady watchfulness. She had become a woman of the plains, her rhythms dictated by the sun and the seasons. They spoke little, but they communicated constantly. A conversation could be had in the way he left a freshly sharpened knife by the vegetable basket, or the way she left a hot plate of food for him by the fire when he came in late from his work. They knew the sound of each other's footsteps, the meaning in the set of each other's shoulders, the profound intimacy of his convalescence, where she had seen him stripped of all his defenses, had forged a bond that words could never have created. He had trusted her with his life, and she, in turn, had begun to trust him with her own. One afternoon, as the sun began its descent, casting long, melancholic shadows across the golden land, Mira rode Dust Devil back from the small creek that bordered their property. She had taken to these rides, exploring the vast, empty country that was slowly becoming her home. On the sheltered, sun-warmed bank of the creek, nestled amongst the dry, rustling grasses, she had seen it, a single, defiant spot of color, a wildflower. It was a small, six-petaled thing, the color of a deep lavender twilight, and it was blooming impossibly, beautifully, out of season. All its brethren had long since withered and gone to seed, but this one flower had chosen to bloom now, in the dying light of the year. To Mira, it was a miracle, a small, perfect symbol of life persisting against all odds. It reminded her of the fragile, unexpected hope that had taken root in her own heart, here, in this desolate, forgotten place. She dismounted and, with a gentle, careful touch, she plucked it from the earth. She held it in her palm all the way back to the inn, shielding it from the wind. Its delicate beauty, a stark contrast to her own calloused, work-worn hands. She did not know what she intended to do with it. It was a feeling, a message, a truth that she could not speak. And this small, brave flower was the only word she had to say it with. When she entered the inn, Calder was at the table, meticulously cleaning his colt, the pieces laid out on an oiled cloth. The room was filled with the warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun slanting through the clean windows. He looked up when she entered, his pale eyes acknowledging her presence with a quiet glance, before returning to his work. Mira's heart beat a little faster. She walked to the table, and without a word, she laid the single, perfect wildflower on the scarred, dark wood, a spot of impossible color in the rustic gloom of the room. Then, she turned and went about her own tasks, busying herself with adding wood to the fire, her back to him, her entire being acutely aware of his stillness. Calder stopped his work. He did not touch the flower. He simply looked at it. He saw not just a weed plucked from a creek bed. He saw the impossible hope it represented. He saw her. He saw a resilience that matched the flower's own, a quiet beauty that had managed to bloom in the harshest of soils. In all his years of living in this unforgiving land, he had learned to see only the practical, the useful, the dangerous. He had forgotten that a thing could simply be beautiful, and that its beauty could be a kind of strength all its own. Mira risked a glance over her shoulder. He was still looking at the flower, and on his face was an expression she had never seen before, a look of profound, unguarded tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. Slowly, as if in a trance, he wiped the oil from his hands. He stood and walked to a large, battered footlocker that sat in the corner of the room, a silent, ever-present piece of his life that she had never seen him open. He knelt before it and unlocked it with a key he wore on a leather thong around his neck. The contents of the chest were sparse, the meager possessions of a man who traveled light through the world. There were a few folded, worn-out shirts, a spare gun belt, and a small, leather-bound book. It was a journal, its cover worn smooth with time and handling. He lifted it out with a reverence that told her it was a sacred object. This was where he kept his ghosts. He brought the journal back to the table. He sat down and opened it. The pages were filled with a tight, spare script, recording dates, places, and names. It was not a diary of feelings, but a stark, factual ledger of a life spent in harsh places. She saw the names of battles, lists of supplies, the prices of horses. It was the unadorned, brutal history of Calder Reese, with a touch as gentle as the one she had used to pluck the flower. He lifted it from the table. He opened the journal to a clean, empty page near the back, and carefully, he laid the wildflower down. He took a page from an old letter from his pocket and placed it over the flower, then slowly closed the book, pressing the small, fragile piece of life into the permanent, silent record of his own. He was making her offering a part of his story. He was placing this moment of quiet, impossible beauty amongst the battles and the losses, an acknowledgement that it was just as real, just as important. He looked up then, and his eyes met hers across the room. The air in the inn grew still and thick, charged with all the things they had never said. The last of the sun's golden light filled the space between them, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. In that long, silent moment, every wall, every defense, every carefully constructed boundary between them dissolved into nothing. She saw in his eyes the vast, lonely landscape of his soul, and for the first time a flicker of light in its most distant corners. He saw in hers not the frightened, broken girl he had found in the storm, but the strong, resilient woman who had saved his life and brought a flower into his house. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. There was only the raw, undeniable truth of what had grown between them in the blood and the silence. Mira felt a profound, peaceful certainty settle into her bones. She had spent her entire life being told what to do, who to be, who to belong to. Her life had been a series of transactions made by men, but no more. She walked toward him, her footsteps making no sound on the wooden floor. She did not feel fear or hesitation. She felt only the calm, quiet power of her own heart. She stopped before the table, her hands resting on the back of a chair. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper, but it was as clear and strong as a well-struck bell in the quiet room. "I was never allowed to choose," she said, her eyes holding his. "My father chose a husband for me. Jedediah Cain chose how I would live, how I would breathe. My life was a debt to be paid." She took a slow breath, letting the weight of her past settle and then fall away. She looked at this scarred, silent man who had shown her what it was to be strong, to be free, to be seen not as a thing, but as a soul. "But this time," she said, her voice unwavering, filled with the conviction of a truth she had earned in blood and fire, "this time is different." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving his, and spoke the words that would change everything. "I choose you, Calder." He did not speak. A man like Calder Reese had no words for a moment like this. Words were clumsy, inadequate things. Instead, he simply reached his hand across the table, his calloused, strong fingers covering hers where they rested on the chair. His touch was warm and firm. It was an answer. It was an acceptance. It was a promise. And, in the golden dying light of that autumn afternoon, it was everything. 2 summers had passed, turning the dust of the plains into a familiar landscape of home. The way station, once a skeleton of a building slumped against the sky, had been given new life. It had a sound roof now, a porch that no longer sagged, and windows that were clean and clear. The sign for the traveler's respite had been taken down, for this was no longer a place for passing through. It was a destination. The fences Calder and Mira had built stood strong, defining their small patch of the world. Inside those fences, life thrived. The garden was a riot of green and color, yielding more than enough to fill the larder for the coming winter. The chickens scratched in the dust, and the barn, once a place of gloomy neglect, now housed 2 strong horses and a milk cow. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady, comforting plume, a signal to the vast, empty plains that here, in this one small spot, there was warmth and life, a home. On this particular afternoon, the air was thick and still, heavy with the promise of a coming storm, but it was not the violent, bruising sky that had first brought Mira to this place. This was a summer storm, the kind that smelled of clean water on thirsty earth before the first drop even fell. The clouds building in the west were high and white, edged with a soft, benevolent gray. Mira and Calder sat on the top rail of the newly finished southern fence, the one that looked out over the widest stretch of pasture. They sat close, their shoulders nearly touching, a comfortable, practiced proximity that needed no thought. Years of silent conversations and shared labor had worn away all the sharp, uncertain edges between them. Calder's hand rested on the rough wood of the rail, and Mira's lay beside it, their little fingers gently intertwined. It was a touch so light, so natural. It was like breathing. In the field before them, a small boy of about 7 ran through the tall, golden grass, his laughter carrying back to them on the warm, humid air. He was chasing a grasshopper, his small legs pumping, his straw-colored hair a bright splash against the green and gold of the pasture. This was Tom. He had come to them the previous winter, a half-frozen, silent orphan from the small, struggling settlement a day's ride away. A wave of fever had swept through the town, leaving behind a handful of new graves, and a small, bewildered boy with no one left in the world, the circuit preacher. Knowing Calder Reese was a man who kept to himself, but was not without a core of decency. had brought the boy to their door. He had stood on their porch, a small, tragic figure wrapped in a threadbare blanket, his eyes wide and empty with a grief too big for his small body. Mira had seen a reflection of her own lost, frightened self in the boy. Calder had seen another ghost, another life threatened by the casual cruelty of the world. They had taken him in without discussion, the decision made in a single, shared glance. The first few weeks had been filled with a profound, watchful silence. Tom did not speak. He ate what was put before him, slept in the small room they made for him, and watched them with old, tired eyes. It was Calder who had finally broken through. He didn't use words. One afternoon, he sat on the porch steps, a block of soft pine in one hand and his skinning knife in the other. He began to whittle, the blade moving with its old, sure precision, curls of pale wood falling at his feet. He didn't look at the boy, who was watching from the doorway. He simply worked, and after a while, he began to whistle, a low, tuneless sound that was surprisingly gentle. He carved a horse, its lines simple but full of life. When he was done, he set it on the step and walked away. A few minutes later, the horse was gone. The next day, Tom spoke his first word. Again. Now, the silence in him was gone, replaced by the boundless, joyful noise of a boy who had been given a second chance at childhood. He was a part of their quiet life, a bright, unpredictable thread that had woven itself into the fabric of their days, making it stronger, richer, and infinitely more precious. Mira watched him, a soft, maternal smile on her face that she was not even aware of. She had never dreamed of being a mother. She had only ever dreamed of being free. It had never occurred to her that the two could be the same thing. She leaned her head slightly, resting it against Calder's strong shoulder. He smelled of sun and sawdust and the clean scent of the coming rain. It was the smell of safety, the smell of home. "He has your eyes when he's concentrating," she said softly, her voice a low murmur against the fabric of his shirt. That same way of looking at something as if you can see right through to its center. Calder made a low, rumbling sound in his chest, a sound that was as close to a laugh as he ever came. "He has your stubbornness," he replied, his voice just as quiet. "Once he sets his mind to something, the whole world could burn down around him and he wouldn't notice." They fell silent again, watching as Tom finally gave up on the grasshopper and flopped down in the tall grass, content to lie on his back and watch the magnificent clouds build in the sky. He was safe. He was loved. He was home. The simple, profound truth of it settled over Mira, a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer sun. She thought back to the girl she had been, the one who had stumbled onto this porch in a storm, her heart a frozen knot of terror. She thought of her first, desperate question, born of a lifetime of being told she was wrong. The world was still a dangerous place. Men like Jedediah Kane still existed. The quiet life they had built here was a fragile thing, a small circle of light in a vast, encroaching darkness. But it was real, and it was theirs. They had built it, defended it, and filled it with a quiet, stubborn love. She turned her head, looking up at his profile. The hard, unforgiving lines of his face had been softened by time and peace. The ghosts were still in his eyes. She knew, but they no longer haunted him. They were a quiet, settled part of him, a sorrow he carried with a gentle strength. There were new things in his eyes now, too. Warmth, contentment, a fierce, protective love that she saw every time he looked at her, or at the small boy lying in the field. Her own journey mirrored his. The fear was a scar now, not a wound. It was a part of her story, a reminder of the darkness that made the light so precious. She was no longer defined by what she had run from, but by what she had chosen to build. She lifted her head from his shoulder, her gaze holding his. The first cool drops of rain began to fall, fat and slow, making small, dark circles in the dust at their feet. The air was suddenly alive, electric with the scent of ozone and wet earth. She whispered the words, not with the desperation of that first night, but with the quiet, teasing intimacy of a shared memory, a secret language only they understood. "Tell me if I do it wrong." A slow smile spread across Calder's face. It was a rare, beautiful thing, a sight that still made her heart ache with a fierce, protective tenderness. It transformed his harsh, scarred features, revealing the gentle, steadfast man who had been hiding beneath the armor all along. He lifted his free hand, the one not intertwined with hers, and gently touched her cheek. His calloused fingers were warm and familiar against her skin. He looked deep into her eyes, and in their pale depths, she saw not the reflection of a broken, frightened girl, but of a strong, beloved woman. He leaned in, his voice a low, rough whisper that was meant for her alone. A final answer to a question that had been answered 1,000 times over in silent, daily acts of love and devotion. "There's no wrong tonight, Mira." And as the summer rain began to fall in earnest, washing the dust from the air and promising new life to the thirsty plains, they sat together on the fence they had built, their hands intertwined, watching the boy who was their future. The world outside their small patch of land was still full of dangers and uncertainties, but here, in this place, under a sky that no longer held any darkness for them, they had found each other. They had found their home. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and consider hitting the hype button to help more people discover it.